Welcome everyone to week 6. My name is Dr. Neville and I will be your guest lecturer for today. Last week we finished off with a look at terrorism and poverty. Today we shall be focusing on global inequality. Since the end of World War I, global wealth has increased dramatically, and recently in places like India and China, millions of people have been brought out of poverty. But at the same time, poverty remains very high in certain places. Another great concern is the growing gap. Some of the questions we shall try to answer today are: why does poverty persist today? Why has it declined in some countries and grown in others? And what can be done to decrease poverty and inequality? The very first question, though, is why should we address poverty in the world? The first reason is that we should because it would be immoral or at least unethical not to do anything. The second reason is that it is seen as a source for a wide range of problems that affect rich countries as well as poor, including terrorism, immigration, crime, and health threats. Immigration is a particular concern at the moment with the mass migration from North Africa into Western Europe. It makes it more difficult to combat environmental issues. It can be hard to convince a starving person in Africa to not poach or to not burn fossil fuels. Finally, the poverty of other states can restrict the growth in wealthy ones. It keeps overall consumer demand lower and restricts expanding markets. A difficulty can arise, though, from how we define and measure poverty. It can be measured in absolute terms, meaning a person who has a low enough income, or in relative terms, as a person who has a lack of choices, including standard of living, along with other cultural, economic, and political rights. Poverty in absolute terms is easier to measure, while inequality is harder, as we must decide what an acceptable gap is. If both the wealthy and the poor are getting richer, but if the wealthy are getting richer faster, does this mean that the gap is growing or shrinking? So what are the different sources of measurements? We have GDP per capita. This is the gross domestic product of a country divided by the number of citizens. This is probably the most widely used number, but if the wealthy elite have enough money, they can cover up the number of poor people. GDP per capita can tend to underestimate poverty. There's also purchasing power parity, or PPP. This uses GDP, but also takes into account how much different things cost in a country. If you go abroad sometimes, the products can seem extremely cheap, which means that you can buy more things. Your money has more purchasing power. While this measurement is more accurate, it is more difficult to calculate because it requires a lot more data. Another measurement is the poverty line. The World Bank has set a global standard of $1.25 per day in 2005. This is probably possibly the most arbitrary of all measurements. We also have the Human Development Index, or HDI. This was developed by the UN, and it expands upon the PPP by including living conditions. This is an attempt to measure the relative poverty. It also measures life expectancy, literacy rates, and average years of schooling, amongst other things. From these different measurements, it is quite possible to come up with very different conclusions about the state of poverty around the world. We have looked at the UN before and stated how they are involved on these sorts of issues. In 2000, the UN created the UN Millennium Development Goals. These were a series of targets to achieve by 2015. This was done to encourage more action on this issue and to have a way of measuring the actual progress made. You can very easily Google the report to read up on the results. Some of the goals are almost impossibly ambitious, while others are far more attainable. It was not really the point to complete them all, but instead draw attention to the topic and actually start tackling it in order to encourage development. What we have today is the problem of late development. There are a lot of difficulties facing states that are trying to develop after the first states, mainly in Western Europe. Most of these states rely upon export of raw materials like agriculture, fuel, and minerals. This used to be the most expensive part of the production process, which made these products more valuable, but as labor and other factors have increased in price, this has forced the price of other raw materials down. This has made it much more difficult for the later developing states to earn enough money. They are also much more vulnerable to price changes. Even oil has recently dropped in price, which has hurt a significant number of countries as they must import much of the higher end products the country needs. So what are the strategies for development today? If earlier developing countries developed at the expense of other countries, especially their colonies, how can these former colonies develop on their own? The first strategy is known as import substitution. This is the strategy of domestically producing goods that they have already been importing. This could make them less reliant upon other countries, and because they are already importing them, it means that there is already a market for them. This strategy has been successful for some countries in Latin America as well as Japan and India. This strategy has not always been successful. Firstly, timing is critical. Countries that try to develop stronger domestic markets have suffered because of the rising oil prices. Secondly, these new domestic markets have sometimes failed to compete internationally, which they need to do in order to remain viable. As a result, these domestic markets were often protected with high import taxes and subsidies. This tended to become permanent, which led to corruption, which enriched the elite without helping the people. State socialism was a radical departure from the early developers that rejected capitalism and private property. While this is not the right class to go into depth on this model, it utterly failed. China was able to succeed by moving towards import substitution by the 1970s. The final strategy is export-led growth. In response to the failures of import substitution, a group of East Asian countries developed almost the opposite strategy of export-led growth. These countries have become known as the Asian tigers, and they move towards the rich countries and their money. They look to produce higher level goods domestically, but then sell them internationally and bring the profits back home. These products needed to be better and cheaper than those produced in rich countries. This process was made easier by the cheap labor, a tactic being used by China today. Once they produced more simple goods, they could move on to higher end products where there is even more money. The major risk to this strategy is that they are vulnerable to depressions or slumps, as they do not have the domestic markets to buy all the products they produce. This model also is not straightforward, as the countries that it worked best for, including Japan and Hong Kong, have had significant assistance from rich nations. Finally, in the 1970s, when this was working at the best, there was less competition in the international marketplace. Today, this is a far more daunting prospect. So far, we have looked at how developing nations can help themselves, but what about international aid? There is considerable debate on how helpful it actually is. It is undeniable that in some situations aid is essential in order to avoid a humanitarian crisis. There are several problems with international aid, which we shall look at now. Firstly, most international aid goes primarily to governments. This is because they are the organization in charge of caring for the citizens of a country, but the government can be the central reason for the problems of the country. The money can do little to fix this, and it may not be long until more money is needed. This can lead to corruption, which means the money could be wasted or stolen. This is particularly dangerous when the money is a loan. Countries can be left in a cycle of debt that they can never get out of. Another problem with international aid is that it can leave the country as quickly as it enters. A government will often spend the money abroad to get what they need to survive. The true value of money is circulating within an economy and multiplying. This is known as the multiplier effect. But in this situation, it is not felt by the recipient country, but often the donor country. The true benefit of the aid, therefore, actually goes to the donor. From these arguments, we can draw several conclusions. It is very difficult to implement foreign aid successfully. It will most likely require a competent and fair government in order to work, but considering that these are very rarely the types of governments that need help, will it ever work? In the case of Greece, who has required several bailouts and support, while they are not considered corrupt, they have run up high levels of deficit spending, which definitely suggests that they are not competent. Their inability to fix their problems in the meantime would certainly lend credence to this argument. But can we trust the free market? It is very difficult to test this idea. To withhold aid would be extremely inhumane. Besides, every country in the world practices market interference to protect their own markets, so it does not really exist. This is one of the most difficult issues facing the world, and one where there does not seem to be a simple solution. There is, though, newfound agreement on the need to tackle it, and with success stories like China, India, and Japan, there is hope for the future. Next week we shall be covering environmental issues.